Whenever we imagine North American military incursions, we visualize them as an extraordinary action movie, but is that true in all cases? The Vietnam War was a particularly conflictive war for the United States, and many of its missions had serious problems being successful. In today's video, we're going to explore the most important ones, so get ready for a trip to the middle of the jungle that was a humiliating nightmare for Americans. Welcome once again to military aviation. Operation Rolling Thunder. In the effervescent decade of the 1960s, in the midst of the Vietnam War, the United States undertook the titanic Operation Rolling Thunder with the ambition of altering the fate of the war. However, this military enterprise would become a monumental failure that would leave an indelible mark on North American war history. Conceived in 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder had as its main mission to decimate the military and logistical infrastructure of the Viet Cong and the Communist North Vietnam. The strategy was brutal and forceful. It focused on a sustained aerial bombing campaign over North Vietnam, hoping to dent enemy morale and force its leaders to the negotiating table. Despite such aspirations, the complexities and strategic decisions quickly led the operation to founder due to problematic twists and turns. One of the fundamental failures lay in the lack of clarity and objectives and the absence of a unified tactic. The bombings, in their desire to undermine the enemy's military capacity, failed to effectively distinguish between military and civilian objectives, which unleashed indiscriminate destruction of towns and cities. This mistake not only alienated the Vietnamese population, but also eroded international support for the American cause. Another variable that affected the correct development of the attack was the lack of effective coordination between the various branches of the North American armed forces. This factor also contributed to the failure of the operation to the point of being decisive. But they were not only mistakes of the Americans, but virtues of the Vietnamese. Beyond the tenacity characteristic of the Easterners, their tactical reading was much more refined and efficient than that of the United States forces. However, the American aerial performance is spectacular to see. The war machine failed to annihilate much of Vietnam's prosperous industry in either 1 month or over the 3-year campaign. Surprisingly, the intricate paths and highways continued to be used, and the bridges, despite the damage, were rehabilitated and reopened with impressive speed. It has been calculated that, in economic terms, each dollar spent on the destruction of Vietnamese infrastructure required an exorbitant expenditure of $9.6. This mismatch between the resources invested and the results obtained sheds light on the ineffectiveness of the strategy, revealing a disconcerting reality. The conflict was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in an economic game of high costs and low dividends. In 1968, with the withdrawal of American forces, Operation Rolling Thunder culminated as a strategic and tactical fiasco. Easter Offensive. In the escalating conflict unfolding in Vietnam, the Easter Offensive, carried out by American forces in 1972, went down in history as a tumultuous chapter in the military history of the United States. The backdrop of the offensive was complex and multifaceted. North Vietnam, determined to change the course of the war, launched a massive onslaught against South Vietnam. In response, the United States undertook the Easter Offensive, hoping to reverse the defeat suffered by the Southern Vietnamese. However, the strategic and tactical disadvantages against the Viet Cong were palpable. The lack of coordination between American forces and their South Vietnamese allies was one of the fundamental reasons behind the failure. Synchronization between the various military units was poor, creating tactical gaps that the enemy cleverly exploited. The Eastern armies were as intelligent as they were ruthless, and their methodology did not take into account the codes of Western warfare, causing disasters among American ranks. Northern Vietnamese leaders implemented ingenious tactics, such as the use of intricate underground tunnels and the deployment of highly mobile assault forces. These methods, combined with the density of the Vietnamese jungle, created a scenario where American soldiers faced an elusive and difficult-to-contain enemy. Another determining factor was the failure to adapt to the guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. The reluctance to adjust the strategy significantly contributed to the setbacks suffered by American forces. The static and poorly organized nature of American troops made them easy targets for the Viet Cong's methodology. Deadly traps, treacherous attacks, and savage ambushes became the daily nightmare for the fighters of the country led by Nixon. Meanwhile, Americans continued to believe that bombings could be effective, as evidenced by this testimony.
The number one thing we did was coordinate the airstrikes. General Hollingsworth went to General Abrams and begged for all the B-52s he could get, and on the 10th and 11th of May, he planned a B-52 strike every 50 minutes for 24 hours.
The Easter Offensive lasted extensively, stretching until October 1972. The results were not good, and the magnitude of the failure became evident. Human and material losses were considerable, and the inability to achieve strategic objectives disillusioned both the public opinion and military leaders. This military incursion marked a negative milestone in the Vietnam War for United States combatants. It became a critical lesson about the need to adapt to the realities of the battlefield. It also ingrained the importance of strategic coordination between local and allied forces to successfully achieve objectives in complex military conflicts. Battle of Hue. Hue, one of the nation's most important cities, would become the epicenter of a fierce struggle between American forces and the Viet Cong in the first quarter of 1968. The fight for control of the city was intense and fraught with strategic obstacles that the Eastern forces cleverly exploited to their advantage. The narrow streets and labyrinthine architecture of Hue were intelligently utilized by the enemy as favorable terrain for ambushes and surprise attacks. Whether with makeshift weapons or professional ones, American soldiers succumbed to Vietnamese assaults as if they were mosquitoes of the eastern jungle. This type of close quarters and surprise combat was one of the fundamental reasons why the strategy of United States troops failed so calamitously. Those leading the war appeared visibly lost, as seen in the following material.
Colonel Cheatham, what's the objective and what are your men about to do?
Well, I've got two companies here that are just about to clear the next two blocks up. I've got one company in this big building here that I guess it's the end of the Way University, and they are going to start firing in support of Foxtrot Company, which will be going up this road here on the left, and attempt to take a couple large wall buildings that are on up about 500 or 600 meters.
Doubt arose when there was a possibility of killing a civilian, a deed that could mean mortal danger for the soldier or their comrades. This was the chaotic board on which death and deception danced a dangerous dance with the combatants. The lack of precise intelligence about the situation in Hue exacerbated the complexity of the battle. Inadequate data collected on the strength and location of the enemy made effective operational planning difficult. This strategic information gap allowed the Viet Cong to take advantage of the confusion and maintain fierce resistance. At the culmination of the Battle of Hue, the Eastern forces had seized control of the city, successfully driving out a set of humiliated and defeated American troops who never managed to gain a foothold in the contest. Spring Offensive. Another complex chapter loaded with challenges and disappointments during the Vietnam conflict was the so-called Spring Offensive in 1968. North Vietnam orchestrated a massive onslaught against South Vietnam, very similar to that of 1972 that we have just told you about. For this reason, the Americans decided to assist and combat the Viet Cong and their allies with this operation. The objective was similar to the Easter Offensive, so it was expected that American troops had learned from their mistakes, and this time the contest would be more balanced. However, it seemed that history was going to repeat itself. The purpose in the advance of North Vietnam was to besiege the capital of their southern counterpart, Saigon. At midnight on April 28th, the city was engulfed in an unprecedented assault, with attacks coming from all directions except from the sea. The capital was besieged. By April 29th at 3 p.m., the transports, armored vehicles, and combat units of the attacking force emerged from the dense forest, crushing any resistance that stood in their way to the capital. In response to the North Vietnamese advance, the United States launched the Spring Offensive in hopes of maintaining stability in the region and expelling the invaders. However, from the very beginning, strategic and tactical disadvantages were once again evident. The lack of coordination between American forces and their South Vietnamese allies proved crucial to the failure. By that time, the Vietnam War had already sparked growing disillusionment among young American fighters. No one had any patriotic or ideological motivation to sustain the war effort initiated by President Lyndon B. Johnson. In this context, the Spring Offensive only intensified the distrust and skepticism among troops who witnessed their comrades dying amidst Viet Cong traps and strategically disorganized chaos. Finally, on April 30th, Saigon fell into the hands of the invaders while the population desperately tried to escape by any means possible. This milestone marked the fall of Saigon, an event that would resonate in history as a reminder of American military incompetence. These were some of the most dishonorable and forgettable episodes in American military memory. The shameful performance of the troops will go down in history as strategic and tactical errors committed by the high command of the United States Army, who underestimated the battle and paid the price with the lives of their soldiers. We are reaching the end of this interesting episode. We look forward to your opinions in the comments box below, and we await you in the upcoming deliveries of military aviation.